On the morning she was meant to vow forever, Helena Marbury heard the truth no bride should ever hear. Her groom wanted her dowry, not her heart. Still dressed in white, she ran from the church into the London fog and collapsed at the gates of the most feared duke in the city. What begins as a scandalous escape soon becomes a dangerous choice between the safety of silence and the courage to speak, against a man, against society, against her own fear. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and do you believe a period romance can begin with betrayal and still end in true love? London, 1864. The city awoke beneath a blanket of grey fog, the kind that clung to stone and skin alike, softening every outline while sharpening every secret. Inside St. Bartholomew's Church, where polished pews and white lilies awaited celebration, Helena Marbury stood alone in a small antechamber, her hands trembling against the smooth satin of her wedding gown. The lace at her collar felt suddenly too tight, as if warning her that the day meant to crown her future would instead unmake her heart. She had stepped into the corridor only to fetch her ivory gloves, only to breathe a few steadying breaths. Instead, fate delivered a cruelty she would never forget. From behind the slightly ajar door of the vestry, she heard Edwin Harwood's voice, too familiar and too cold, speaking to his closest friend with a confidence stripped of all tenderness. He said he would marry her to extinguish his debts. Helena pressed a hand to her mouth, her heart pounding painfully as Edwin laughed softly at the idea of securing her dowry before his creditors reached him. A wave of disbelief swallowed her whole, followed swiftly by a searing humiliation that spread from her chest to her limbs. The lace veil draped over her shoulders seemed suddenly to weigh 100 stones, as if burdened by the shame she had not earned. For a long moment she stood frozen, her hazel eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall. Then something ancient and fierce awakened within her. With a whisper of silk and lace, Helena stepped back, turned, and fled. She slipped out through a side door, the church bells tolling distantly, as if calling her back to a life she could no longer accept. Her feet carried her down the stone steps, her skirt brushing the ground like a ghostly trail behind her. The fog embraced her at once, swallowing her white figure as she stepped into the vastness of London's morning streets. Carriages rumbled past, their lanterns glowing like watchful eyes. Street vendors stared. A pair of ladies clutched their shawls as they whispered behind gloved hands. Helena felt every gaze like a blow. The satin gown that should have crowned her joy now proclaimed her disgrace to the world. Yet she walked on, her breath shaking, her heart splintering with every step. Her family was in Bath, tending to her aunt's sudden illness. There was no father waiting to receive her, no mother to shield her trembling body, no sister to wipe the tears she fought to contain. The city felt immense, cruel, and indifferent. She had believed the morning would change her life. It had, just not in the way she imagined. As she crossed toward Grosvenor Square, the fog thickened until she could scarcely see the cobblestones beneath her feet. Her vision blurred, the world tilted. She did not know whether the cold or the heartbreak struck first. She only knew the strength drained from her limbs as if grief had hollowed her bones. Her fingers grasped at nothing, her breath caught, and the silk of her gown whispered one last time before her body crumpled onto the damp ground. Footsteps approached, heavy, purposeful, guards' boots cutting through the fog. A voice pierced the haze, firm yet softened by concern. The men from Ashcombe House had been patrolling the perimeter of the Duke's estate when they found her, pale as moonlight and lying motionless at the edge of the square. One guard knelt beside her, brushing aside the veil that obscured her face, and drew a sharp breath. She looked as though she had stepped out of a shattered painting, a bride without a wedding, a vision undone by sorrow. Believing she had been attacked, the men lifted her with utmost care. Her head lolled gently against one guard's shoulder, chestnut curls spilling free from their pins. As they carried her across the iron gates of Ashcombe House, lantern light flickered across her closed eyes and fragile form, casting her in a glow that made her appear both fragile and impossibly brave. The estate loomed before them, its grand facade rising through the fog like a silent sentinel. None knew yet that this unconscious young woman would stir the stillness of the infamous Duke's household. None knew the scandal beginning to take shape. None knew that the heart of London itself would soon tremble with her name. But for now, Helena Marbury lay quietly in their arms, the weight of betrayal upon her, carried into the only sanctuary fate had not yet denied her. Helena Marbury awakened slowly, as though surfacing from the depths of a nightmare that clung to her like the last shreds of mist before dawn. Her eyelids were heavy, trembling beneath the weight of an unfamiliar light. The scent of beeswax, lavender, and burning embers filled the air, wrapping around her senses like a comforting yet disorienting veil. When she finally dared to open her eyes, she found herself gazing upon carved oak columns rising toward a ceiling adorned with intricate frescoes. A fire crackled in a grand marble hearth nearby, casting its glow upon walls lined in dark velvet. This was not St. Bartholomew's. This was not her home. A surge of panic jolted her upright. The silk of an unfamiliar bedspread pooled into her lap like liquid silver. She gasped as she realized she still wore the remnants of a bridal gown. The once pristine satin was torn and rumpled, streaked with the faint dirt of the city's streets. And beside the bed, laid carefully atop a gilded chair, rested her veil, its edge torn where she remembered grasping it in despair. Much of her hair had fallen loose from its braids, chestnut waves spilling wildly down her shoulders. Her heart thudded sharply as her gaze darted across the lavish chamber. She saw deep draperies pulled across tall windows, the rich crimson fabric embroidered with gold thread. Heavy, ornate furniture filled the room, far too opulent, too commanding to belong to anyone other than a person of immense power. Her lips parted, breath unsteady. Where was she? Before the thought could fully settle, the heavy door to the chamber creaked open. A tall figure stepped inside, framed by the gentle flicker of firelight. Adrian Blackthorne, Duke of Ashcombe. Even without yet knowing his name, Helena felt the enormity of his presence. He carried himself with that unmistakable authority, reserved for men who commanded not just rooms, but entire cities. His dark frock coat emphasized his broad shoulders, while shadows clung to the sharp planes of his face. His hair, raven black, was combed neatly back, revealing a faint scar along his jaw, and his eyes, steel grey, penetrating and unreadable, fixed upon her with a gaze that made time itself hold its breath. Helena instinctively drew the bedcovers to her chest, her pulse quickening. Yet when he stepped closer, she sensed something beneath his severity that she could not name, something quiet and concealed beneath the armor of power. "You are awake," he said, his voice deep and resonant. There was no softness in his tone, yet neither was there cruelty. Helena swallowed, her throat dry. "Where am I?" she whispered. "In Ashcombe House," he replied, taking a measured step inward. "My guards found you collapsed at the edge of Grosvenor Square. You were alone, in this attire, and unconscious." His gaze flicked to the gown she clutched. "I feared you had been harmed." She felt her cheeks warm with shame. She had not been harmed, merely shattered. His eyes softened by the faintest degree, as though he sensed the fragility of her world. "Do you recall what drove you to wander the streets in such a state?" he asked. Helena hesitated. Speaking of her humiliation aloud would make the betrayal too real. She lowered her gaze, fingers twisting the edge of the covers. The truth pressed against her ribs, aching to break free. "I was to be married this morning," she murmured. He said nothing, but she sensed his attention sharpen. The impression that nothing escaped him was almost unnerving. Her voice trembled like a fragile thread. "I discovered that the man I was about to wed sought only my dowry." Tears burned behind her eyes, but she willed them not to fall. I could not stay. I could not bear the weight of such deceit. The words left her lips, and for a long moment silence hung heavily in the chamber. Adrian's expression did not change dramatically, yet something within it shifted. A flicker of understanding passed through his eyes. Perhaps he knew betrayal too intimately not to recognize the pain of it in another. "You were right to flee," he said, his voice lower, more controlled, "and you showed courage in doing so." Helena blinked, taken aback. She had felt many things in those desperate moments: fear, humiliation, despair, but courage had not been among them. Her breath wavered. "My family is away in Bath. I have nowhere to go." Adrian studied her for a moment before responding. "Then you shall stay here. For now, you are under my protection." Helena stared at him, uncertain her ears heard correctly. "My lord, I cannot impose upon your kindness. If anyone learns I am here, then no one will learn," he interrupted, firm and absolute. "This estate has many wings and many secrets. If a woman requires shelter from society's cruelty, Ashcombe House will not deny her." His words settled upon her like a protective cloak, but she also sensed the quiet command behind them. He was a man accustomed to defying judgment and authority alike. Yet fear surfaced in another form. "What will your household think of me?" A hint of dry humor flickered across his eyes. "They are already terrified. They believe I do not allow women inside these chambers." He gestured slightly, letting the words linger. "And they are correct." Her breath caught. "Then why?" Adrian continued, his gaze steady. "I did not bring you here, but once you crossed my threshold, I could not abandon you in your suffering." Helena felt emotion tug violently at her chest. The tension between them thickened, an invisible thread pulled too tightly. He took a step closer, and though he kept a proper distance, his presence seemed to fill the room entirely. She noticed, with a sudden flutter in her heartbeat, that he smelled faintly of sandalwood and winter air. "Miss," he began, inviting her to offer her name. "Marbury," she whispered. "Helena Marbury." His gaze softened once more. "Miss Marbury, no one shall disturb you while you remain here. You have my word." His word. That simple promise carried a gravity that steadied her heart more than any warm blanket or comforting touch could have. A knock at the door broke the moment. A servant, dressed in somber livery, appeared cautiously, bowing his head. His eyes darted curiously to Helena, but one sharp look from Adrian silenced any unspoken questions. "Tea and broth, Your Grace," the servant announced. "Leave it," Adrian ordered. The tray was set carefully near the bed, and the man retreated, closing the door behind him. Helena noticed the slight tremble in the servant's hands. The household believed their master capable of anything. The fear was almost tangible, hanging in the very air. But she saw a different truth. A man who protected and never boasted of it. A man whose sternness masked a wound far deeper than his visible scar. Helena reached for the teacup with delicate fingers, still chilled by the memory of the streets. Adrian watched her closely, ensuring her hands steadied before she took a sip. Warm liquid spread through her, soothing the ache in her throat. "I thank you, Your Grace," she murmured. "You owe me nothing," he replied. "Nor should you thank me for doing what a decent man must." Her eyes lifted to his, drawn by the sincerity in his voice. Their gazes met, his intense as iron, hers shimmering with fragile hope. A spark of something undefined passed between them, small yet undeniable. Her heart stumbled. Adrian straightened, reclaiming his mask of composure. "Rest now. When you have regained your strength, we will discuss what must come next." Helena nodded faintly. The weight of exhaustion pressed upon her, the shock of the morning slowly giving way to a weary numbness. He turned to go, his coat brushing lightly against the air with each step. At the threshold, he paused. Without looking back, he spoke quietly. "You are safe here, Miss Marbury. No man will harm you under this roof." A vow, unspoken, yet absolute. She watched him leave, the chamber feeling impossibly vast in his absence. The crackling fire softened its glow, and Helena lay back against the pillows, her hands resting over her thudding heart. In a single morning, she had lost the future she believed was hers, but within these strange and secretive walls, she sensed her heart had been carried somewhere new, somewhere unknown, yet impossibly alive. For the first time since fleeing the church, Helena allowed her tears to fall. They slid silently down her cheeks, shimmering like pearls upon the satin sheets. And though grief still clung to her, she clung also to the only fragile certainty she possessed. She was no longer alone. Not in this house of shadows, not in the bed of London's most feared duke. Ashcombe House stood as a monument of silence and shadow, rising from the fog as if carved from the stone of old regrets. It was not a place for music or laughter. It was a house that whispered, that remembered. The halls were vast, the ceilings high, the windows dressed in heavy velvet that allowed only slivers of light to pierce the gloom. And yet, within that sombre mansion of carved mahogany and candle-lit corridors, Helena Marbury began to breathe again. Her first days were spent in the western wing, far from the servants' gossiping eyes and the ceremonial wings reserved for grand receptions, long since abandoned. There, behind locked doors and silken drapes, she was permitted a solitude both soothing and strange. The gowns left for her were modest but finely made, dresses in dove grey and pale blue, with high collars and long sleeves, the fabric soft against her skin and free from ornamentation. Helena wore them with grace, her silhouette gliding through Ashcombe's corridors like a quiet echo. It was Lady Rosalind Everley who first stepped across the invisible threshold of Helena's isolation. A woman of 31, with copper-red hair and eyes the colour of storm-lit meadows, Rosalind did not knock when she entered the chamber where Helena sat reading near the fire. She simply appeared, as though summoned by instinct. "I thought you might appreciate something warmer than silence," she said, setting down a tray with 2 cups of steaming tea. Her voice carried the kind of cultivated ease that only the truly perceptive possessed. Helena looked up, startled. "Thank you," she murmured, cautious but not unkind. Rosalind smiled faintly and lowered herself into the armchair across from her. "They say the Duke has brought a ghost into the West Wing," she said lightly. "But you don't seem the ghostly sort. You seem far too real for that." Helena's lips parted slightly. "Is that truly what they're saying?" Rosalind stirred her tea. "Not precisely. Some believe you are an heiress with a scandal too great to name. Others say you are his ward, spirited away from a convent. And a few of the footmen are convinced you're a governess, fleeing an unwanted marriage." She lifted an arched brow. "None of them, however, suspect the truth." Helena lowered her gaze. "Then you know it." "I know what I was told," Rosalind replied, setting down her cup. "And I know what I see. A woman who has suffered deeply, and who carries her dignity like armor." Helena could not speak for a moment. The words stirred something unsteady in her chest. "I left my own wedding," she said softly, her voice barely above the crackle of the fire. "But not because I had the courage to walk away. I left because staying would have been unbearable." Rosalind regarded her carefully. "That, my dear, is precisely what courage looks like." In the days that followed, Rosalind became a quiet fixture in Helena's new life. She came not to interrogate, but to sit, to share her observations of society's absurdities, and to gently anchor Helena to a world that no longer seemed entirely lost. In her presence, Helena rediscovered the strength to smile, even if faintly. Outside the estate, London swelled with rumours. Word of Helena's disappearance had reached the drawing rooms and parlour gossip circles with dizzying speed. She had vanished, it was said, in the middle of her wedding morning. Some insisted she had suffered a nervous collapse brought on by the weight of social expectation. Others claimed she had fallen prey to a fit of madness, an inherited weakness from her mother's side, perhaps. And most convenient of all were the versions told by Edwin Harwood himself, in which he cast himself as the heartbroken groom, abandoned at the altar by a capricious and hysterical bride. "He says he tried everything to help you," Rosalind informed her one afternoon, her voice edged with disdain. that he feared for your mind, that you were unwell. Helena's spine straightened. How very generous of him. Rosalind studied her with a level gaze. Do not underestimate the damage of a lie told by a man in need of redemption, especially one skilled in charming those who would rather not ask questions. Helena turned toward the window. The late afternoon light filtered through the drapes, casting long shadows on the carpet. I cannot go back, even if I wished to. The moment I stepped outside these walls, I would be devoured by the scandal he created. Rosalind rose and joined her at the window. Then it is fortunate you reside in a house that was built to withstand storms. Helena glanced at her, puzzled. Rosalind's lips curved. You are not the only one the world has misjudged. It was in the library that Helena found the traces of the man who had given her shelter. Books filled the shelves in languages she could not read, volumes on astronomy, law, medicine, and war, and poetry, tattered collections with notations in a hand she now recognized as Adrian's. His presence lingered there, in the scent of leather-bound spines, and the quiet order of a mind that sought to make sense of a disordered world. She had not seen him since that first evening. His absence did not feel like neglect. It felt like a boundary, deliberate and respectful, but not cold. Still, she could not help the way her thoughts returned to him, the firm set of his jaw, the intensity of his eyes, the way his voice softened only when speaking to her. There was a gravity to him, something heavy with memory and shaped by pain. She mentioned this once to Rosalind. He is not cruel, Helena said, folding a letter she had never finished writing. But he is feared. Rosalind's expression turned distant. Adrian Blackthorne is feared because men prefer monsters to martyrs. It is easier to believe he's ruthless than to admit what they did to him. Helena looked up slowly. What did they do? Rosalind's fingers drifted over the rim of her teacup. Years ago, Adrian had a younger brother. Gentle, gifted, but too trusting. He was lured into a scandal. Gambling, I believe. One of the Whitmore sons set him up, mocked him publicly. A duel followed. Adrian stepped in when his brother faltered. He was not meant to fight that day, but he did, and he killed the Whitmore boy. Helena's breath caught. They twisted it, of course, Rosalind continued. Claimed Adrian had provoked it, that he was a brute with a taste for blood. The Whitmores held influence in Parliament. His reputation never recovered. And then his brother died shortly after. Consumption, some said. Others whispered it was despair. Silence stretched between them. I had heard something, Helena said at last, her voice tight, but I never knew. No one does, Rosalind replied softly, because Adrian will not defend himself. He believes it beneath him to explain the truth to those who never cared for it. Helena looked toward the closed doors that led to the eastern corridors of Ashcombe House. Her heart beat a little faster. She had come to this house seeking nothing more than refuge. But now she sensed something deeper pulsing through its quiet halls, a grief that had shaped the man who protected her, and a loneliness that matched her own. She rose from her chair, crossing to the fire where her shawl lay draped. As she wrapped it around her shoulders, her eyes lingered on the embers glowing in the hearth. Ashcombe House was filled with secrets, but so was she. And perhaps, in this vast and silent place, she might one day find not just shelter, but someone who saw beyond the silence. Ashcombe House bore the silence of a cathedral and the sorrow of a mausoleum. Its corridors held more than footsteps. They echoed old betrayals, ancestral pride, and the weight of a name that once inspired reverence, but now provoked fear. And in that solemn estate, Helena Marbury began to see beyond the walls and into the man who had offered her shelter. It began in fragments. A door left half open, revealing the Duke of Ashcombe seated before the hearth in the library. His shoulders bowed slightly, as if the fire could warm what the world had frozen within him. A moment in the drawing room when he paused before a faded portrait of two young men on horseback, his gaze lingering with a stillness that seemed almost reverent. A casual question over tea, do you prefer novels or essays, spoken with the careful neutrality of a man unaccustomed to idle conversation. Helena answered softly that she loved both, depending on the weight of her heart. He said nothing, only inclined his head. But his eyes, those unreadable, steel-grey eyes, flickered as if he understood that sometimes the soul sought logic, and other times it needed poetry to survive. He did not haunt the West Wing, nor did he intrude without cause. Yet his presence touched the house like wind against glass, silent, constant, impossible to ignore. The staff grew quieter in his wake. Doors were opened more slowly. Conversations ended mid-sentence. But Helena noticed how things shifted when she passed. The house that had once felt like a fortress of solitude now exhaled a different kind of silence. Not dread, but expectation. It was Rosalind who noticed it first. "You've changed the air in this place," she said one morning as they sat in the conservatory, where sunlight filtered weakly through leaded glass and dust floated like golden ash. Helena looked up from her embroidery, startled. "I have." Rosalind smiled faintly, threading her gloved fingers around the handle of her cup. It breathes differently now, softer, as though waiting for something to begin. Helena flushed. "I have done nothing but try not to disturb the rhythm of the house." "Then you have already done more than most. Ashcombe has had no rhythm for years." The words settled over her gently, like snow on stone. She did not ask what had silenced the house. She knew now. She had heard the whispered truths, had read between the lines of Rosalind's stories and the spaces left unsaid. Adrian Blackthorne had once been a man with a brother, a future, and a place in the world. But those had been stripped from him, by a duel, by politics, by a society that demanded perfection and punished loyalty. It was not only his brother who had been lost that year. It was Adrian's place in the world of men who ruled by influence and smiled as they ruined. And yet, here he stood, commanding, precise, intact in body but not in soul. One afternoon, Helena stepped into the study to return a book she had borrowed. The chamber was unlit, dim with the coming dusk, and the scent of leather and ink wrapped around her like memory. On the far side of the room, standing before a tall window shadowed by ivy, stood the Duke himself. He turned when he heard her, though his expression did not change. He was dressed not in a coat, but in shirt-sleeves and a waistcoat, his cravat removed, the high collar of his shirt unfastened. She had never seen him thus, unguarded, dressed more for thought than for power. The soft lamplight illuminated the scar that traced a clean line from his jaw to the hollow just below his ear. It was not grotesque, but it was stark. A wound that had never faded, a truth that the world had twisted into legend. "I apologize," she said quickly, her voice catching. "I did not mean to intrude." He looked at her for a moment, then shook his head slowly. "You are not an intrusion, Miss Marbury." The words were quiet, but they settled deep within her. She placed the book on the table. "I finished it sooner than expected." "What did you think?" he asked, stepping away from the window. "It was unkind," she said, "and brilliant. The kind of story that leaves you lonelier when it ends." Adrian nodded, and something passed between them, unspoken yet unmistakable. She moved to leave but paused, her fingers brushing the edge of the desk. "May I ask something?" His posture shifted slightly, but he did not object. "Why did you keep the portrait in the North Hall?" she asked softly. "The one of your brother." Adrian's eyes darkened, and for a heartbeat, Helena feared she had overstepped. But then he exhaled, slowly, deliberately. "Because removing it would be erasure," he said, "and grief deserves more respect than silence." Helena felt her throat tighten. "I'm sorry." He shook his head. "You have nothing to apologize for. You asked what no one else dares to mention." She looked at him fully then, and he looked back. And in that gaze something changed, not softened but opened. She saw not the Duke the world feared, but the man who had once stood on a field of honor, defending his brother and burying him soon after. A man who still bore the weight of a reputation he never tried to mend. Later that evening, as she walked alone through the gallery wing, Helena found herself drawn to that same portrait. The young man in it bore a resemblance to Adrian, lighter in colouring, more joyful in expression. He sat atop a chestnut horse, one hand raised in greeting. The background was pastoral, the mood untroubled. But Helena knew now what followed that image. She stood there for a long while, studying the face of the boy who had broken beneath the world's cruelty, and the shadow of the man who had borne that cruelty in his place. That night, she could not sleep. Her thoughts twisted through fragments, Adrian's voice in the dim library, the quiet assurance in his words, the scar the world had turned into a lie. She rose and moved toward the window, opening it just enough to feel the cold air press against her skin. The sky beyond was overcast, the moon veiled, the wind whispering secrets only the broken could understand. Far below, in the courtyard, a figure moved. She knew the silhouette instantly. Adrian stood alone beside the stone fountain, his head bowed, his coat unbuttoned, the wind tugging at the hem. He was still, as though listening for something no one else could hear. And though she could not see his face, she sensed the weight he carried. The grief, the anger, the loyalty that had cost him everything. Helena pressed her hand to the glass. In another life, she might have stayed in her window, turned away, and let him remain alone in the dark. But not this one. Not now. Because she too had stood in the wind with nothing but sorrow. She too had been whispered about, pitied and erased, and in him she saw not a monster, but a mirror. Below, the figure turned slightly, as if he had felt her gaze. She stepped back from the window, heart pounding. He did not look up, but he stayed a moment longer before walking away, vanishing into the shadows of Ashcombe House. And in the quiet that followed, Helena whispered his name, not as the world spoke it, not as legend had twisted it, but softly, like a prayer spoken by someone who had seen beneath the armor. Adrian. London devours what it cannot control. By the second week of Helena's disappearance, the city no longer whispered. It roared. Drawing rooms buzzed like hives, newspapers fanned the flames, and every street corner seemed to host some variation of the same murmured phrase. The Marbury girl had vanished on the morning of her wedding, and someone powerful was hiding her. The scandal refused to rest in idle curiosity. It demanded an answer, a name, a sacrifice. And Parliament listened. The Whitmores, aristocrats polished by generations of political cunning, saw in the chaos a long-awaited opportunity. Beneath their polished civility lay a bitterness that had never healed. It had festered since the duel that claimed their eldest son and publicly disgraced the Duke of Ashcombe. The details had been buried in vague accusations and muffled testimonies, but to the Whitmores, the outcome had never been forgiven. Now, years later, the Duke's silence had bred mystery, and mystery had bloomed into myth. And myth, when mixed with power and spite, became the deadliest form of truth. Their campaign began subtly, editorials penned under pseudonyms, questioning the integrity of powerful men who lived behind locked gates. Rumors whispered into the ears of influential clergymen and members of the House of Lords. The suggestion that a young woman had been lured, perhaps coerced, into the shadows of a duke's estate, that her mind, fragile and wounded, had not been protected, but claimed. At first, Adrian said nothing. He moved through Ashcombe House like a ship slicing through ice, silent, composed, precise. But Helena saw the changes, the minute shifts. His shoulders stiffened more often. He stood longer by the hearth at night, staring into flames that reflected nothing but restraint, and the letters that arrived each morning were no longer from publishers or scholars. They bore the red wax seals of men who governed. In the drawing room, Rosalind set down the morning paper with trembling fingers. "They are calling you a recluse, with unchecked influence," she muttered. "A predator hidden behind titles and locked doors. They say Helena may not be with you by choice." Helena stood by the window, her gaze fixed on the frost, tracing delicate silver lines across the glass. "Then I must go." Rosalind turned sharply. "What?" "I must leave this house," Helena said. Her voice did not tremble, but her fingers clenched the folds of her dress. If I remain, he will be hunted. I am not worth a second scandal. Rosalind crossed to her, fierce and unflinching. You are worth far more than the lies they speak, but you are not safe out there. Not now. I was not safe here either, Helena said softly, until he made it so. She did not wait for permission. She stepped out of the room, heart pounding, skirts whispering against the marble floors like leaves stirred by wind. She found him in the library, where the light was always dim, the windows always veiled. He stood with his back to her, one hand resting on a volume he did not open. Your Grace, she said, and the title struck the air like a warning. He turned. His expression was unreadable, though his eyes betrayed fatigue. Miss Marbury, she inhaled. I must leave Ashcombe House. He studied her for a long, silent moment. No, the refusal was not shouted nor cruel, but it rang with a finality that made the room feel suddenly smaller. She stepped forward. I cannot be the reason they come for you. The city is on fire with my name, and you will be the one who burns. Let it burn, he replied. She stared at him. They have power, connections. You know what they're capable of. Yes, he said, his voice low, measured. But I will not send you out into a world that would devour you to save itself. Her throat tightened. And I will not watch you fall because of me. He crossed the space between them in 2 strides. Do you truly believe, he said quietly now, that your leaving would silence them, that they would forgive me if I cast you out into the lion's mouth? She opened her mouth, then closed it. Her heart thudded painfully. They want blood, he said, softer still. Not justice, not truth. And if you were to go, Helena, you would not vanish the rumors. You would confirm them. She looked up at him, and he looked down at her. Close now, too close. The scent of him, cedarwood, leather, fire wrapped around her, and her breath caught in her chest. Then what do we do? She whispered. We endure. The word rang through her like a bell. She had endured much in the days since she fled her wedding. But never had she felt so seen, so fiercely defended, not even by her own blood. Adrian Blackthorne stood before her not as a duke, not as a legend, but as a man who had chosen her safety above his own legacy. Why, she asked, her voice breaking. Why risk everything? He did not answer at once. The silence stretched, trembling between them. Then, with a gentleness that shattered her, he said, Because I know what it is to be abandoned in the hour when the world turns. Helena's breath caught. She had heard of his brother, she had heard of the duel, but she had not understood the depth of the wound until now, not until she saw the shadow flicker across his face like the ghost of a memory too heavy to speak aloud. He took a step back, as though the air had grown too intimate. If you wish to leave, I will not stop you, he said, but I will not cast you out. She wanted to speak. She wanted to say something that might match the gravity of what he had just given her, but no words came, so she simply nodded. The following morning, a rider arrived at Ashcombe House. The letter he bore was sealed with a symbol Helena did not recognize, but Adrian did. He read it in silence, standing by the window in his study. Outside, the fog had thickened, and the trees bowed as if mourning. When he finished, he folded the parchment with exacting care and placed it in the fire. Parliament had summoned him. Rosalind entered moments later, eyes sharp. Will you go? He looked at her, and though his face remained composed, something in his eyes fractured. If I don't, they will come here. She approached him with uncharacteristic hesitation. What if this is a trap? Adrian's smile was grim. It is always a trap. He left that afternoon, clad in a dark coat, his cravat tied with simple precision. Helena watched from the window as he mounted his horse, the wind tugging at his coat, his profile cut in iron against the pale sky. He did not look back, but she felt him. Every beat of his silence echoed in her chest. As his figure disappeared into the mist, Helena pressed her hand to the glass, her reflection ghosted beside the world outside. She had never feared her own name before. Now it was a blade, sharpened by men who never once cared whether she had consented, whether she had chosen this place, this man. She turned away from the window. She would not weep. Instead, she stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the weight of ancient stone, by velvet and firelight, and she whispered a vow to herself. If London demanded blood, she would not let Adrian bleed alone. The storm came not with thunder or lightning, but with the quiet strike of polished boots on marble and the opening of a door that was never meant to be crossed. The air in Ashcombe House that morning was tense, as if every wall sensed what was about to unfold. Beyond the gates, the world was shifting. Within them, the truth was about to bare its teeth. Helena stood in the conservatory, surrounded by ivy and glass, the air heavy with the scent of earth and withering roses. Her hands were clasped tightly before her, the fabric of her dove-grey gown crumpling between her fingers. Since Adrian had returned from Parliament 2 days prior, silence had cloaked the house. He had said little, but the weariness in his eyes had spoken volumes. She had just turned toward the door when a voice cut the quiet like a blade. "So it's true. You are here." She froze. The voice did not belong in this place. It was sharp, rehearsed, and polished with entitlement. When she turned, she found Edwin Harwood standing in the arched entry of the conservatory, his overcoat damp with fog, his gloved hands clenched at his sides. His appearance was impeccable, as always, wavy blonde hair perfectly combed, cravat tied just so, boots shining despite the morning mud. But the mask of charm he once wore so effortlessly had cracked. His expression was twisted in barely contained rage and something worse, panic. Helena did not speak at first. She simply looked at him, allowing the silence to do what words could not. Shame bloomed in the hollows of his gaze. "You disappeared," he said, stepping closer. "And now the entire city speaks of me as if I were some villain from a penny novel. My investors are pulling out. My name is tarnished. My mother won't leave her room." "I didn't ask you to lie," Helena said, her voice even but low. "Nor did I ask you to follow me," he scoffed. "You didn't give me a choice." "I gave you no choice." She took a step forward. "You spoke of me like a possession to be acquired. You gambled away your fortune, and when I was to be your salvation, you sold me with words before we ever reached the altar." Edwin's face flushed. "You were emotional, fragile. You misunderstood." Helena tilted her head, her hazel eyes steady and unflinching. "I was devastated, but I was not fragile, and I misunderstood nothing." His mask dropped completely. "You will come back. You will marry me. We will claim you suffered a breakdown from grief over your mother's death, and that I waited patiently for your recovery. People will believe it. I've already written the letter." "No," she said. Edwin blinked. "What?" "No," Helena repeated. Her hands trembled, but her spine remained straight. "I will not marry you. I will not be part of your performance." His voice dropped to a hiss. "You are ruining me." "You ruined yourself," she whispered. "I only stepped aside and let the truth be seen." He surged forward, eyes wild. "You think he will protect you forever? You think the Duke of Ashcombe will make you respectable again? You are a fallen woman now, Helena, a stain. No one will ever see you the same." The words struck like a whip, but Helena stood firm. "I would rather be ruined in truth than respectable in a lie." He reached for her wrist, grasping her arm with a force that startled even him. And then he froze, because a shadow crossed the conservatory entrance. Adrian Blackthorne stood in the threshold, his expression unreadable, but his presence suffocating. He wore no coat, only a black waistcoat over a starched white shirt, sleeves rolled back to his forearms. There was no weapon in his hand, no violence in his voice, but his silence was more lethal than any blade. "Let her go," he said. Edwin dropped Helena's arm as if burned. Adrian stepped forward slowly, his eyes locked on Edwin's. "You've come into my house, touched what is under my protection, spoken words that should never be spoken to a woman." "I came to reclaim what is mine," Edwin said, though his voice faltered. Adrian's gaze darkened. She was never yours. There was a pause, heavy and still. Then Adrian added, voice low, but I promise you this, Mr. Harwood, if you raise your hand to her again, even once, no court in England will protect you from me. Edwin paled. Rosalind appeared behind them just then, summoned by instinct or the tremor in the air. She took Helena's arm gently and guided her from the room, her eyes never leaving the men. In the hallway, Helena could feel her breath shaking, though she tried to keep her expression calm. He won't try again, Rosalind said quietly, guiding her toward the sitting room. He lacks the courage to face a man who can't be bought. Why did he come now? Helena asked, her voice distant. Why now? Rosalind's expression turned grim. Because he knows what's coming, and he hoped to control the story before it controls him. Later that day, Adrian found her in the music room, where she sat alone at the old pianoforte, her fingers resting on ivory keys she had not pressed in years. He did not speak at first. He waited until she lifted her gaze to his. He's gone, Adrian said. He won't return. Helena nodded, her voice caught somewhere behind her ribcage. Thank you. You shouldn't have had to face him alone. She looked at him. You've protected me more than once, Your Grace. I wonder what I've ever done to deserve it. His jaw tightened. He moved to the hearth and stared into the unlit grate. I once believed the truth would protect me, he said after a long pause. When my brother was challenged to a duel, I told him to refuse. He wouldn't. He said honor was all a man could offer when he had nothing else. Adrian's voice dropped, touched by memory. But when the Whitmore boy drew his pistol early, it was I who stepped in. I killed him, not out of vengeance, but to save my brother. And I was not praised for it. I was vilified, because the Whitmores had power, and I did not. Helena rose, stepping closer. He died months later, Adrian continued. Illness, they said, but I knew it was shame, and so I chose silence. I thought dignity would preserve me. He turned then, and for the first time she saw the full wound, not the scar on his face, but the deeper one carved into his soul. They painted me as a monster, he said, and I let them. I thought it would keep the wolves at bay. Helena stepped forward. Her fingers trembled as she reached for his hand. He did not pull away. I don't believe them, she said softly. I see you, Adrian. He looked down at their joined hands, then up at her, his eyes storm-grey and unguarded. You shouldn't, he said, but there was no conviction in it. Then stop giving me reasons to, she whispered. They stood there, caught in a stillness that was not peace, but something more fragile, more dangerous, a kind of emotional nakedness neither of them had dared before. Outside, the sun dipped behind clouds. The first drops of rain began to strike the windows like fingertips tapping to be let in. Inside, beneath the quiet tension of candlelight and memory, Helena knew the world beyond was sharpening its knives. But for this breath, this hour, she was no longer running, and neither was he. The storm came not from the sky, but from ink. London awoke to scandal dressed in bold headlines and acidic whispers. A pamphlet, printed in cheap paper, but inked with venom, flooded the city in a single day. It bore no author's name, but the message was unmistakable. It accused the Duke of Ashcombe of seduction, coercion, and abduction. It painted Helena Marbury not as a wronged bride, but as a confused young woman who had been spirited away and hidden in luxury by a man whose name had long inspired both fear and fascination. The pamphlet bore her likeness, crudely sketched, pale and weeping, and his, shadowed and monstrous, standing over her like a captor. The author, of course, was no mystery. The Whitmore family's hand lay heavy in the ink, their hunger for vengeance finally unleashed with precision. For years they had waited, watching Adrian walk freely in the halls of Parliament, his silence mistaken for survival. Now, they used the very tool he had long denied himself, public opinion, and wielded it like a dagger aimed at his throat. Crowds gathered outside Ashcombe House. They came with curiosity at first, then with indignation, and finally with torches of righteous anger lit not by evidence but by rumor. Protesters stood at the gates, shouting for justice. Women clutched their shawls and gasped. Men demanded inquiries. Journalists, hungry for sensation, camped at the corners of the street, hoping for a glimpse of the ghost bride or the infamous Duke. Inside the house, silence reigned like a funeral. Helena stood in the drawing room, the morning paper trembling in her hands. The pamphlet was folded beside her, but its words burned through her still. She could not breathe without hearing them again. A willing victim, they had written. A girl whose mind had been influenced, whose will had been claimed, whose reputation could only be salvaged if she returned, promptly, obediently, to the man who had once been her fiancé. "It is not truth they want," Rosalind said bitterly, pacing the room in a gown of deep amethyst, her jaw tight. "It's spectacle, and if they must tear you apart to build it, they will." Helena said nothing. Her thoughts moved too quickly, crashing one against the other. Shame, fury, fear, and something deeper. Betrayal not only by Edwin or society, but by the very fabric of the world she had once believed in. "They are demanding Adrian answer before the house," Rosalind added, pausing to look at her. "And if he does, if he denies this publicly, he will be called to prove it. They will demand your testimony, and if you remain silent, they will say you are complicit. If you speak, they will say you are a liar." The fire crackled in the hearth, the only sound in the room for several heartbeats. Then Helena said very softly, "Then I will speak." Rosalind turned to her, startled. "Helena? I will not let him fall for giving me shelter, for treating me with respect when the man meant to marry me treated me like a transaction." Her hands clenched the folds of her dress. "I will not be silent so they can devour him in peace." Rosalind moved closer, her expression unreadable. "Once you step into that world, they will never let you go. You will be seen, not as you are, but as they choose to see you. Are you ready for that?" "No," Helena whispered, "but I will do it anyway." She wore no jewels, no silks, no elaborate curls in her hair. When she appeared beside Adrian at the front steps of Ashcombe House that afternoon, she wore a gown of pale blue wool with a simple lace collar. Her hair was pinned modestly, her hands bare. She looked not like a duchess, nor a scandal, but like a woman who had decided to speak. The crowd was larger than she imagined. Carriages lined the street, gentlemen in top hats, ladies with parasols lowered in anticipation, reporters with ink-stained fingers and eyes that glittered with hunger. At the center of it all stood Adrian, calm as marble, his expression unreadable. When she stepped to his side, a collective murmur swept through the crowd. Adrian looked down at her, the question in his eyes unspoken. She nodded once, then turned to the crowd. "My name is Helena Marbury," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "And I am not missing." Silence. Not one breath moved. "I left my wedding because I learned my fiancé intended to marry me for my fortune," she continued, her voice ringing with truth. "I did not flee in madness. I fled in sorrow. I collapsed on the streets and was found, unconscious, by the guards of Ashcombe House. The Duke did not lure me here. He saved me." A wave of shock rippled through the audience. Rosalind stepped forward, her figure regal and commanding. "I, Lady Rosalind Everley, have been a guest of Ashcombe House during Miss Marbury's stay. I witnessed every moment. She has not been coerced. She has not been mistreated. She has been protected." Still, the silence held. Helena's voice broke it. "If you wish to believe lies," she said, her voice softer now, "there is nothing I can do to stop you. But I will not be silent so that others may sleep better believing I deserved what was done to me." A single voice called out, "Why hide?" Helena turned toward it. "Because I was afraid. Not of the man who gave me shelter, but of the world that would never believe I had the right to leave the one who did not." The crowd shifted. Murmurs gave way to murmured understanding. One woman dabbed her eyes. A man removed his hat. Adrian said nothing throughout. He stood beside her, steady as stone, allowing her voice to carry. And when she finished, he offered her his arm, not to possess her, not to shield her, but to walk with her. They entered the house again in silence. Inside, the doors closed with finality. Rosalind met them in the corridor, her face pale, her eyes bright. "That was either the bravest thing I have ever seen," she whispered, "or the most foolish." "Both," Adrian murmured, glancing at Helena. "But it was hers to choose." Helena said nothing, but the weight of what she had done settled into her bones. She had spoken. She had shattered the silence. And London, for all its cruelty and pride, had listened. Not completely, not kindly, but it had heard her voice. In her chamber that evening, she stood before the mirror and unpinned her hair. She saw a different reflection than the one who had arrived at Ashcombe. Her face was the same, but her eyes held something deeper, not defiance, not pride, conviction. Outside, the crowds had begun to thin. The pamphlets were now questioned. Parliament buzzed with gossip, but no longer with certainty. And somewhere in the shadows, the Whitmores began to realize that Helena Marbury would not be broken in the dark. She had stepped into the light, and she had not flinched. Ashcombe House held its breath. The gates, once symbols of aristocratic grandeur, had become walls against a city that hungered for scandal. Guards stood at the entrance with tightened postures, and carriages no longer passed without slowing. Though the crowd had thinned since Helena's appearance, the weight of watching eyes remained. London's judgmental gaze, always peering through lace curtains or trailing ink across columns of newsprint. Inside, time felt suspended. The staff moved quietly, their steps hushed, their glances lingering a moment too long on doorways that had never before seen such history unfold. Meals were delivered with care, but no words. Fires were stoked before dusk and left to burn through the night. And through it all, the house echoed with the unspoken truth. Something had changed. Helena had spoken, and Adrian had let her. And now, within these high stone walls, stripped of distraction and shielded from society's reach, there was nowhere left for them to hide, not from others, nor from each other. It began in small moments. A glance across the hallway held a second too long. A silence filled not with discomfort, but with questions neither dared ask aloud. A shared walk through the frost-kissed gardens, where conversation lingered in the air like the pale clouds of their breath. In the evenings they read beside the same hearth. She sat with her feet tucked beneath her on the embroidered settee. He stood near the window, half turned toward her, always listening. The fire flickered across his face, softening the edges that had once seemed carved from iron. She spoke of her mother's lullabies and the orchard behind their home in Sussex, of a childhood filled with modest joys and quiet disappointments. He spoke of books that had shaped him, of battles lost in Parliament, of memories with his brother he had locked away for fear they might undo him, and slowly, piece by fragile piece, their defences crumbled. One night, a storm swept over the city, rain drumming against the windows like urgent fingers. The wind howled down the chimney, and thunder rumbled like distant grief. Helena had risen from her chair to draw the curtains when she felt him behind her. Not close, not intrusive, but present. She did not turn. "I've always loved storms," she murmured, her hand resting on the heavy velvet. "They sound like the world is weeping." Adrian's voice came softly, or perhaps screaming. She lowered her hand and turned to face him. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, those storm-grey eyes, were unguarded. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly. She blinked. "For what?" "For all of it," he whispered. "For the things you've endured, for the pain you had to name in public, for the weight I've placed on your shoulders." "You didn't place it," she said gently. "You shared it." He looked at her then, not as the Duke or the Protector, but simply as a man who had carried silence too long. "I was prepared to face the world alone," he said. "I was raised to believe solitude was safer than trust. That detachment was strength." "And now?" she asked, her voice almost a breath. "Now I find myself terrified of what it would mean to lose you." Helena's heart faltered. Adrian took a step forward, not bold, but measured, as though offering her every chance to retreat. He reached for her hand, his fingers brushing hers with reverence. "I love you, Helena," he said, low and rough with truth. "And I know the cost. I know what society will say. I know the price they will demand if you choose to remain by my side." She looked down at their joined hands, the contrast of his strength and her softness, the meeting point of two souls long starved of refuge. "Do you think me afraid of the world?" she whispered. "No," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I think the world is afraid of you, because you speak with honesty, and they cannot bear it." She lifted her gaze, her eyes shimmering with tears that did not fall. "You are not my ruin," she said. "You are my home." He inhaled sharply. She stepped closer, resting her forehead against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart against her cheek. His arms came around her, tentative at first, then certain, not to possess her, not to shield her, but to hold what he feared he might never deserve. In that embrace, no words were needed. It was not a kiss. It was not passion burning at the edges. It was something slower, deeper, the quiet surrender of two hearts no longer willing to pretend indifference. They stayed there for what felt like an eternity, wrapped in silence and stormlight. Later, Helena sat by the fire with a book in her lap, unread. Adrian stood at the mantel, his fingers curled lightly over the edge. The room was dim but warm, and the distance between them was no longer filled with uncertainty. It pulsed with something almost sacred. Rosalind entered quietly, pausing in the threshold. Her gaze moved from Helena's softened expression to the faint vulnerability in Adrian's stance, and something in her eyes changed. Without a word, she crossed to Helena and placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. "I'm writing to Lady Merivale tomorrow," she said casually. "She controls half the invitations in Mayfair. If I begin now, perhaps by spring, the drawing rooms will speak of you not as the girl who vanished, but the woman who rose." Helena looked up, her throat tight. Rosalind's smile was small but sure. "Let them try to cast you out. I've watched the city bow to less worthy names." Adrian turned toward her, a silent nod of gratitude passing between them. "I will stand beside her," Rosalind added softly, "and they will not be able to look away." Helena reached up and covered Rosalind's hand with her own. That night, as she prepared for bed, Helena stood before her mirror and saw more than the reflection of a woman changed by scandal. She saw a survivor, a fighter, and for the first time she saw someone loved not in spite of her strength, but because of it. Adrian had not come to her chamber door. He would not, unless invited. But his presence lingered in the air, warm and steady. She walked to the window and opened it slightly. The rain had softened to a drizzle, and the city lights flickered like distant stars. Somewhere beyond the walls, London still gossiped and judged. But here, in the quiet sanctuary of truth, something else had taken root. Not defiance, not defense. Love, quiet, unshaken, and no longer hidden. The day of the hearing dawned beneath a grey London sky, as if the heavens themselves withheld judgment. Carriages clattered over cobblestones outside Westminster Palace, delivering peers of the realm, ministers, and whispering onlookers to the chamber where reputations were forged or shattered. Within the high walls and iron-latticed windows of the Assembly Hall, the air was thick with anticipation and the faint scent of ink, wax, and powdered wigs. The name of the Duke of Ashcombe had not rung so loudly through the corridors of power since the duel that cast his name in shadow. Now it would ring again, but this time with Helena Marbury at its centre. Helena sat poised on a wooden bench just behind Adrian, her back straight, gloved hands resting in her lap. She wore a modest navy blue gown with ivory buttons and a high collar. Respectable, unadorned, and deliberately demure. Her hair was pulled back into a simple twist. No pins of silver, no lace veil, no perfume to invite frivolous remarks. She had chosen dignity, and it clung to her like armor. Every eye that had once searched for scandal now beheld a woman made of steel and sorrow. Adrian stood ahead of her, tall and still in his dark tailcoat, the pale scar along his jaw made more visible beneath the chamber's harsh lighting. His presence silenced the initial murmurs. There was no denying the fear he inspired, but today it was his control, not his fury, that commanded attention. At the bench opposite, Edwin Harwood rose, lips pressed into a falsely mournful line. He wore mourning colours, an insult, as though Helena's absence had buried his happiness. He bowed low to the assembly, then turned with forced gentleness toward the peers. "My lords, I come not as a man seeking vengeance, but as a citizen concerned for the welfare of a young woman once promised to be my wife, who vanished on our wedding day and has since been held, I fear, under dubious circumstances." Helena's fingers curled slightly. She did not move, did not speak, but her silence was brimming with contempt. Edwin continued, his voice smooth as oiled glass. "Miss Marbury has always been of a delicate constitution, highly impressionable, tragically burdened by a fragile nervous state. I grieve for her, and it is with pain that I must express my concern that she may have fallen under undue influence." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Adrian did not turn. His jaw flexed once, but Helena stood. Gasps echoed. The gallery stirred. She took one careful step forward and placed herself beside the Duke, her voice carrying not in volume, but in clarity. "My lords," she began, her gaze moving calmly from one noble face to another, "I am not mad, nor am I delicate. What I am, what I was deceived by a man who sought only my dowry. I overheard Mr. Harwood confessing this on the morning of our wedding. He wished to marry my fortune, not my heart. When I fled the church, I was not abducted. I sought safety, and I found it." A hush fell over the chamber. Even the quills ceased scratching. "I am here by my own will," she continued, "and no man has controlled my choices since that morning, not even the Duke of Ashcombe." Edwin's lips parted, but no sound came. His eyes darted to the peers, as if begging for support. None came. "I do not claim perfection," Helena said, voice trembling now with the cost of her truth, "but I do claim the right to protect my dignity. And I will not permit it to be stolen again under the guise of concern." She stepped back. Adrian, who had not so much as breathed too loudly, now turned to her, not with pride, but with awe. The speaker gestured. "His Grace may speak." Adrian moved forward, each footstep echoing like a hammer on judgment's anvil. When he turned to face the room, it was not as the feared Duke, but as a man who had lived too long in silence. "There was a duel," he said plainly. "Years ago. My brother, barely 19, was tormented by the heir of the Whitmore family. Letters prove this. Threats, extortion. When my brother tried to put an end to it, the young Whitmore struck him, twice. I arrived to find my brother bleeding and I intervened. I struck back. The heir did not survive." He paused, allowing the weight of his confession to settle. "They called me a brute, but I stood trial and was cleared, yet the Whitmores whispered their version louder. They turned Parliament against me in whispers, painting my defence as aggression, and I accepted it. Until now. The peers watched, faces like carved stone. I did not ask Miss Marbury to come to my home, but when she did, I saw in her a kind of truth I had long forgotten existed. She stayed not because I forced her, but because the world outside would have devoured her." Then softer, "If this is to be judged, let it be I who is judged. Spare her the weight." He stepped back. Rosalind rose from the gallery, regal in her emerald silk and velvet gloves, her chin lifted with the haughtiness of a marchioness unafraid of her own power. "I will speak," she said. A pause, then nods from the bench. "Miss Marbury is no victim," she said. "She is a woman of uncommon bravery who faced the humiliation of an abandoned bride and emerged with her head held high. I was there when she arrived at Ashcombe House. I have seen no trace of madness, only strength." And if London society cannot recognize that, then perhaps society is what needs correcting. A stunned silence. Then slowly the tide turned. One noble whispered, another nodded. The murmur swelled, not with outrage, but with re-evaluation. Later, as the chamber emptied and the torches dimmed to dusk, Helena stood at the threshold of the colonnade, overlooking the Thames. The wind lifted tendrils of her hair, and her heart still pounded from the weight of every word she had spoken. Adrian joined her, his expression unreadable. "I would not blame you," he said, voice low, "if you chose to walk away. The name Ashcombe carries a burden even now, and I will not hold you to anything said in the storm." Helena looked at him, and then, slowly, she reached for his hand. "I'm not afraid of storms," she said. "Not anymore, and I'm certainly not afraid of your name." His eyes closed for the briefest moment, as though her words had pierced through armor long calcified. "I would give you back your peace," he said, "even if it meant losing mine." "You are my peace," she whispered. And with the eyes of Parliament still echoing in their memories, and the judgment of the city still undecided, Helena made her choice. Not as a woman swayed by sentiment, but as one who had weighed the cost and dared to love anyway. The spring air held a softness that seemed almost unreal after the long, bitter season that had wrapped Ashcombe House in silence and scrutiny. Now beneath a gentle sky, the colour of faded porcelain, the gardens bloomed again, not only with wisteria and white lilacs, but with the hush of anticipation. The very earth seemed to hold its breath. Helena stood near the old stone fountain that marked the heart of the private garden. A canopy of climbing roses arched overhead, delicate blossoms trembling in the morning breeze. She wore a simple gown of ivory muslin trimmed with soft blue silk, unadorned except for a locket at her throat, the only relic she kept from her past life. The satin ribbon around her waist was not purely ornamental. It had been tied by Rosalind herself, with hands that trembled more than either woman dared acknowledge. Adrian approached quietly, his footsteps muffled by the gravel path. He was dressed in a navy coat, tailored so finely that not even the wind dared to wrinkle it, and he held no ring, no grand token, only a single sprig of white heather in his palm. When he reached Helena, he did not speak immediately. He only looked at her, and in that look was everything he had not allowed himself to dream: hope, fear, and the fragile audacity of joy. "I have nothing to offer you that the world values," he said softly. "No restoration of name, no certainty of welcome among society's circles, no peace without shadows. But I offer you the only truth I have left. I love you, Helena. Not for what you endured, not for what you restored in me, but for who you are. Will you stay, knowing what the world may still whisper?" Helena's lips parted, and for a moment she said nothing. She reached up and touched the locket, then looked at the white heather in his hand. "You gave me refuge," she said. "But more than that, you gave me back the right to decide who I am. You stood beside me when I had no name left to defend. And now, I choose you, Adrian. Not because I must, because I want to." The silence between them shimmered with unshed tears. When she took the heather from his hand and tucked it into the ribbon at her waist, it was more binding than any vow spoken beneath cathedral vaults. Their wedding was held within the hour, in that very garden where once only solitude reigned. No carriages lined the drive, no titled matrons gossiped from embroidered pews. There was only Lord Whitfield, whose quiet integrity had outlasted many louder names in Parliament; Rosalind Everleigh, wrapped in dove-grey silk and radiant with the satisfaction of hope fulfilled; and a handful of devoted servants who had come to love their master more in silence than his former friends had ever done aloud. The ceremony was brief and without pageantry. The vicar, an old friend of Adrian's late mother, blessed their union with trembling hands and eyes too wet to hide. As the final words were spoken, and Adrian slipped a plain gold band onto Helena's finger, the world did not roar with celebration, But the garden did, with birdsong and the rustle of wind through the hedgerows and the scent of roses unfurling in the sunlight. It was enough. After the ceremony, they lingered. Lord Whitfield offered a quiet toast, his voice thick with emotion. "To the bravest woman I have ever met," he said, lifting his glass, "and to the man wise enough to recognize her." Rosalind pulled Helena aside beneath the pergola, her smile unguarded for once. "You have changed him," she murmured. "I think he changed himself," Helena replied. "I merely refused to turn away." Rosalind hesitated, then leaned closer. "I may have news of my own, soon. Something I thought I would never find again after all this time, but I shall let the season ripen first." They shared a quiet laugh, both knowing that love, when it comes late, demands reverence. London, for its part, did not transform overnight, but whispers began to shift like weather patterns. The scathing pamphlets ceased. An anonymous editorial in the Morning Gazette described Helena as a woman of startling moral clarity in a world bent on spectacle. Invitations began arriving at Ashcombe House, not from the Whitmores, of course, but from those who had once feared to acknowledge Adrian at all. Some came out of curiosity, others out of guilt. Most were left unanswered. And yet, one small miracle remained. Lady Pemberton, an aging dowager who had once blackballed Adrian from a charity council, sent a bouquet of snowdrops with no card. It was Rosalind who found it and placed it in the drawing-room. "Even stone hearts soften," she mused, arranging the blooms with a touch of irony. In the weeks that followed, Helena slipped into her new role with the quiet strength that had always been hers. She oversaw correspondence, not as a duchess seeking to impress, but as a woman determined to rebuild Ashcombe's place in a world that had once cast it out. She walked with Adrian through every corridor of the estate, memorizing its history, honoring its ghosts, and bringing light where none had dared shine. One afternoon, as she stood in the music room overlooking the square, a carriage passed slowly, the Whitmore crest barely visible beneath the layer of dust. She did not flinch. Adrian came to stand behind her, his hand brushing hers in the most delicate of touches. "Regrets?" he asked, voice low. She turned to face him. "Only that I didn't find you sooner." He kissed her then, not with passion to consume, but with reverence to heal. Their love, tested and weathered, had not sought spectacle. It had not come adorned in silk or sealed with diamonds. It had grown in the shadows of scandal and bloomed in defiance of every whispered lie. By season's end, London knew the tale in hushed reverence. The runaway bride who vanished into the fog only to emerge beside the most feared duke with her head high and her truth blazing. A quiet legend, spoken in drawing rooms and scrawled in secret diaries, of a woman who dared to choose love, not for safety nor for comfort, but for the courage it demanded. Helena Marbury, now the Duchess of Ashcombe, stood not as a symbol of ruin, but as a beacon for every woman told to lower her voice and accept less. And Adrian, once cursed by rumor and exile, now stood taller than ever, not because his name had been cleared, but because he had chosen to love without conditions, and in doing so had become the kind of man even his enemies could not define. In the end, their hearts had triumphed, not with noise, but with grace. Ashcombe House had changed little in 8 years. The ivy still climbed its stone facade in elegant spirals. The chimneys still whispered smoke into the morning mist, and the gardens, always the first to greet the spring, had once again erupted in a soft storm of wisteria, lavender and roses. But inside its walls, everything had changed. A boy's laughter echoed down the marbled hallway. His name was James, 7 years old, with the dark, intense gaze of his father and the quiet, resolute spirit of his mother. And close behind him toddled his sister, Clara, not yet 4, with curls as wild as the wind, and an ever-growing list of questions that no tutor could contain. They belonged to Helena and Adrian, children born not of duty or expectation, but of a love that had survived every test the world had once thrown at them. Helena stood in the threshold of the nursery, her gown a soft plum, her hair swept back with only a silver comb. There were fine lines near her eyes now, marks of laughter, of sleepless nights, of years lived fully. She watched her children with a smile that held 1,000 memories. Behind her, Adrian approached, slower than before, but with the same quiet gravity that had once unnerved all of London. He slipped an arm around her waist and rested his chin on her shoulder. "They'll frighten the governess again. She'll recover," Helena said, amused. "It's her 3rd week. That's already longer than the last one lasted." Adrian chuckled, a sound more frequent now, yet no less precious. Outside, the staff prepared for a small gathering, only close friends and trusted allies. Today marked 8 years since the day Helena had stood in Parliament and turned the tide of a city. They never marked it publicly, but in their hearts it was a quiet anniversary of courage, scandal and love, won in defiance of everything. Lord Whitfield had sent a note by courier, his trembling hand barely legible now, but still lined with affection. Lady Rosalind Everley, now Lady Everley Redmayne, would arrive within the hour, accompanied by her husband and their 2 adopted daughters. Her marriage had shocked society nearly as much as Helena's once had, for Rosalind had married beneath her station, an academic, a man of letters and compassion. But never had she glowed brighter than when with him. Society, for its part, had changed. Not completely, never easily, but the ripples Helena and Adrian created had reached drawing rooms they would never enter. Younger women whispered her name not with pity, but with awe. And there were those who still turned cold at the sound of Duchess of Ashcombe, but even they knew better than to question her standing. The Whitmore family had not fared as well. Their political clout had withered over the years, not because Helena had sought vengeance, but because their own cruelty had become impossible to ignore. Edwin Harwood, once bold with lies and ambition, had vanished into obscurity after being publicly discredited. A final letter had arrived from him 5 years prior, pleading, bitter, hollow. Helena never opened it. She had given him enough of her soul once, no more. That afternoon, beneath the rose-covered pergola where they had once wed, Helena and Adrian watched their children chase butterflies across the lawn. The air smelled of lavender and promise. "Do you ever miss the world we left behind?" she asked softly. Adrian turned to her, his hand finding hers with a familiarity that still sent a thrill through her veins. "No," he said, "because I never truly lived until I stepped away from it. With you." She looked at him, the man once called a monster, the man who had once stood in shadows and now walked freely beneath the sun. "I didn't just choose you," she whispered. "I choose you still." And in that quiet, as the breeze stirred the petals around them and laughter rang from the garden, they knew. Their love had not merely endured, it had bloomed, again and again, like spring returning to a land once frozen. Their names would not be carved into monuments or recited in ballrooms, but in the hearts of those who knew them, in the children who bore their gaze, in the friends who had stood beside them, and in the quiet strength of every woman who dared to speak truth to power. Their story lived on, not as scandal, but as legend. Some stories linger like the scent of lavender in a forgotten garden, subtle but impossible to forget. Helena's journey began in betrayal, but it blossomed into something far more powerful than vengeance. It became a testament to courage, dignity, and the strength of choosing love in a world that prefers silence. Her story reminds us that even when the world turns its back on us, even when scandal threatens to define us, truth, when spoken with grace, can shift the tide. That redemption is not found in grand speeches, but in quiet defiance, in standing firm when it would be easier to disappear. That healing doesn't come from erasing the past, but from writing something braver on top of it. And maybe, just maybe, monsters are not always who we think they are, and heroines don't always wear crowns. They wear scars, bridal gowns left in tatters, and hearts held together by sheer will. If this story moved you, We would love to know what touched you the most. Tell us in the comments, what was your favorite moment, your favorite line? And if you've made it all the way to the end, write the word wisteria below. That way, we'll know you're one of the kindred spirits who stayed until the final petal fell. If you feel inspired and wish to support the team behind these stories, we invite you, humbly and with all our hearts, to consider sending a super thanks with whatever amount you feel called to give. It helps us keep creating heartfelt tales like this one for those who need them most. And if today isn't the day to give, you can still lift this story by sharing it with someone you know, someone who might need to believe again in the quiet strength of love. Don't forget to explore the other period romances we've left for you in the cards above. You never know which story might become the one that stays with you long after the final word. Thank you for being here.